Season's greetings, everyone. It's that time of year again when all three of us prepare some Advent windows for the run-up to Christmas. And the first Advent window on December the 3rd is what 3 hobby tools or hobby techniques can you not live without? I guess like many of you, over the years, I've collected all sorts of hobby tools and different techniques which I've learnt during the course of a miniature wargaming hobby lifetime. I think the one tool I can't do without is a large magnifier, which is made by the Daylight Company and consists of a large magnifying glass round about 9 to 12 inches in width, and which also has an illuminated light around the edges of the magnifier. I started using that about 5 or 6 years ago, really because I was finding, even with glasses, that I couldn't quite always see the details in respect of the figures I was painting. And it was like a revolution. I could suddenly see everything again. And over the years, it's been incredibly difficult to move away from that. I think once you're used to seeing the detail and you can work with the magnifier to be able to paint and also to sculpt or convert different figures, it's really quite difficult to move away from that. I've really enjoyed using it. It's allowed me to feel completely comfortable, reduce eye strain, and the slight awkwardness about the size of the magnifier. It's on one of the angle poised versions of the lamps that the Daylight Company make. The slight awkwardness of fitting that around the painting table is more than compensated with the fact that I feel I can really see all the detail of the figure to be able to paint it. And I think seeing and painting, if you can see well, if it's a good light to see by, then I think you're likely to get good results in respect of your painting. The other 2 items from the list are possibly not the first things I thought about, but going through the various favourite paints or favourite paint brushes or favourite small tool I have for modelling or sculpting wasn't really doing it for me. I was trying to think really of 2 things that I do or have which are kind of integral to the activity that I'm performing. So the first of these is a wet palette. Now many of you already probably use one. They are widely available on the internet and they're not too expensive, to be honest. But I've always been slightly disappointed when I've had a go with a wet palette from one of the manufacturers. They just seem to be a little bit inflexible, and I wasn't completely persuaded by the ability to close up the palette and use the paint the next day. I've got literally hundreds of bottles of paint which I've accumulated over my lifetime. It's not as if I'm running out of paint. But what I do need to have is the paint to be useful and usable throughout the course of a painting session, which is anywhere really between half an hour and, say, 3 hours. So I came up with the idea of a wet palette which doesn't need to be closed, and I wanted to do it in such a way that it was really cheap, super cheap, and really efficient. So my wet palette consists of a Tupperware top from an ice cream container and a piece of sponge which I got from Wilko, which sadly now defunct UK homeware store. And that's just a really simple piece of sponge about 1 centimetre deep and enough to fill the top of this ice cream container. And then a piece of greaseproof paper from a roll of greaseproof paper, which again is purchased for about £1 for 10 metres. So those are the ingredients that I need for a wet palette. Not one which can be closed up, but one where the sponge stays damp and the greaseproof paper can be placed on the sponge. All of the air pockets and bubbles can be smoothed out and the paper is damp and the paint will remain flexible and usable on the greaseproof paper throughout the entirety of that painting session. It's a really, really inexpensive but practical way of making sure that the paints which you place on the palette at the start of the session are still usable at the end of the session. There's no expensive refills, there's no plastic lid to snap, there's no initial outlay because You may well have the greaseproof paper available at home in the kitchen. Almost certainly it's not going to break the bank to buy 6 sponges for 59 pence, which is I think how much mine cost. And I'm still using them about 6 years later. And the ice cream tub was, well, that was free because we'd eaten the ice cream. So that was one of the things that I thought of that I use every single day that I paint. It's the same ice cream tub, different sponge and a separate piece of greaseproof paper for each painting session. The second thing was something which I use all the time when I'm terrain modelling. I like to feel that whatever I'm building is at the right scale for the figures I have. And there's an element that I can do that by eye because I've done it lots of time over the years. But I have 2 small figures, which are actually First World War figures, which I use really for all of the different terrain I've been building over the last 10 or 15 years. Really so the figure is placed against the scratch-built terrain. So I get a sense of the scale. I get a sense of the height of the doors or the width of the doors or the windows or the placing. Just a classic sort of 28mm figure, which then frames and can be judged against all the different terrain that I'm making. Because it's got to look right. Okay, you have the rule of thumb, you see things in your mind's eye, but there's really nothing like placing a figure by the side of scratch-built terrain to really get the sense of how it works with the figures around it. It's a really simple way of just making sure that things don't just feel right in a rule of thumb, but actually when the figure is standing next to the building or the piece of terrain, it actually looks right as well. So I do that with every single piece of terrain I've made way back since I started doing that, probably around about 2006. I think it probably would have been when I first had the idea. So 2 really simple hobby hacks, a wet palette and the figure to measure against the terrain to complement the magnifier glass for the 3 things that I simply can't do without.